Hi, everybody. This is a re-recording of the Better Together presentation that I, Rinku Sen, made at the Applied Research Center webinar on the relationship between racial justice organizations and LGBT constituencies and issues. That webinar was held on December 2nd, 2010, and Better Together is the name of the report that we produced with support from the Arcus Foundation. I'm going to go through now about 19 slides that focus on providing the information that we gathered in our report. We were looking at 4 guiding questions as we did this study. So we were particularly interested in knowing first how racial justice organizations currently engage with LGBT constituencies and the LGBT equality issues. What kinds of collaborations are going on? Where are people having community discussions? Where are there opportunities for greater involvement? So the first question was, how are groups currently engaging? The second question was, what are the barriers to strong engagement between racial justice groups and LGBT communities, and the work that racial justice groups do on sexual equality issues? The third question we were interested in is, what are the opportunities for future increased involvement? And then finally, what are the changes or efforts that both funders, philanthropists, as well as people working in the fields of racial justice and LGBT rights at the community level can pursue? So those 4 questions were the guiding questions of this study. The way that we did the study was that we first conducted a survey of what ultimately turned out to be 81 organizations. We focused the survey particularly on self-identified racial justice organizations, and we included in that identification or in that definition LGBT groups that are of color, that are primarily serving or organizing in communities of color. And in the end, we had 41 racial justice groups that work on a variety of issues, from police brutality to economic justice, take the survey, as well as 40 groups that were mostly local LGBT organizations of color. We followed up that survey then by interviewing 32 LGBT activists who are working to strengthen the connections between racial justice groups and LGBT constituencies. The first thing that we found is that there are great examples of current engagement. So certainly we found that there is a growing list of LGBT groups of color. These are largely local. They are often providing services like healthcare training or advocacy services around discrimination in housing or workplaces or schools. And they are also, in addition to providing services, organizing around issues of concern to LGBT people of color. Those issues also range from fighting discrimination to things like having comprehensive sexuality education happen in schools so that it is not homophobic sexuality education that takes place there. Some of the examples of these organizations include FIERCE, which is a group of young LGBT people organizing in New York City, the Two-Spirit Society of Denver, which is a Native American group, and API Family Pride, which is an Asian group. In addition to this wonderful dynamic work happening among LGBT people of color, there are also racial justice groups that are taking up LGBT issues. In the state of Oregon, the state's primary farm worker organization, Pikun, has been involved in a 20-year collaboration, for example, with the organization Basic Rights Oregon, and they have worked together to beat back repressive ballot initiatives that were targeted toward immigrants in Oregon as well as targeted toward LGBT people in Oregon. Another example, the South Asian Network, which is in Los Angeles, has created an advisory committee of LGBT South Asian people and has included LGBT issues and people in a community needs survey that they do. The Center for Third World Organizing, which is my former employer, has provided space and fiscal sponsorship to something called the Brown Boy Project, which is organizing people who are of color and relating to a spectrum of identities along the masculinity range. So those are some of the examples of current engagement. We took a look at what makes these projects that are currently existing successful, and there were 4 such elements. The very first one, and I would argue the really core and central one, was that the groups that engage in these projects have an intersectional approach to their communities and to the issues on which they work. So they don't have a narrow conception of what it means to organize the Chinese community or what it means to organize immigrants. They understand that Chinese communities and immigrant communities include LGBT people, and so that a range of issues in those communities would necessarily implicate sexuality issues and people's sexual identities. So a couple of important quotes here from one largely Asian American organization that says, "We don't take the position that we do Asian stuff but don't do gay stuff." This person is really saying that, in their organization, they don't say that, we're an Asian group, and so when opportunities arise to work on sexual equality, they don't say, we're an Asian group, and that gay business doesn't have anything to do with us. Another person that we interviewed said, it's really important to look at both things, racial justice and at the experiences of queer people of color, so that you don't end up with real contradictions in your analysis and in your program. It's this intersectional analysis and intersectional approach that creates for groups a strategic reason, a strategic imperative for taking on LGBT issues, so that they end up not doing that just from a moral perspective because it's the correct thing to do, but rather because it is actually going to move this group forward on its priority issue areas, whether that's economic justice or civil rights. A second element of success is undoubtedly the presence of actual LGBT leaders of color, so that when there is resistance in a community to taking on sexual equality issues along the lines of, we don't really have gay people in our community, that kind of thing doesn't really arise for us, nobody's really asking for that, and so that's not something that this organization needs to take on. It makes all the difference in the world when there is a person in a recognizable leadership position who is on a staff, on a board, on a leadership committee, an organizing committee, who is out and who can testify directly to the fact that there are LGBT people of color who need racial justice and their sexual rights also protected and fought for. There's simply no substitute for having the direct voice of LGBT people in the mix when you're debating what kinds of projects to take up or not take up. The third element of success is that there is an actual formal sharing of power and resources. In the Oregon example that I cited earlier, where the state's farm worker organization and the state's statewide gay rights or LGBT rights organization work together, they actually have people on each other's boards. They take a look at each organization's plans for the coming year and figure out how they're going to work together to protect each other's backs. They share contacts. So, for example, when there was a huge statewide anti-immigrant ballot measure, Basic Rights Oregon, the LGBT group, turned over its contacts across the state to the immigrant rights organization, to the farm worker organization, and made those contacts readily available. So there are advisory committee members or board members, there are actual seats at the decision-making table, and there are written agreements between organizations and communities that take up this work, and that seems to help them be successful. And finally, the fourth element of success is that the groups that take on this work understand that there's going to be a long-term process of doing community education, that not everybody has the perspective in their community that LGBT people are a significant part, both in population and in spirit, of this community. And, one of the problems that we encountered is that there is, in fact, partly because of the way in which LGBT concerns are represented in the mainstream media and, frankly, by some mainstream organizations, there is an impression that many people develop that LGBT people are white people and people of color are straight people, and that is simply not the case. But for LGBT people to be well represented in in racial justice organizations, in communities of color in general, there need to be long-term community education programs that allow communities to address really any questions they have, from the most basic question about whether or not LGBT rights are relevant to our community. And there are many of the organizations that have been successful conduct internal processes within the staff and leadership structures of the organization itself, and they also take those processes outside to the larger community. And they do that in multiple ways over long periods of time. I'm going to move now to some of the barriers to engagement that we found, and that starts with the lack of strategic clarity, which lines up to the very first element of success. So to the degree that having strategic clarity and having an intersectional analysis helps people be successful, not having it is a barrier to racial justice groups actually getting involved in LGBT issues and making space for LGBT people in their own communities to be involved in their racial justice groups. So much of what this comes down to is that groups that are working on police brutality don't understand, don't have a clear picture that LGBT people in their communities are taking a disproportionate brunt of police harassment, search and seizure kinds of practices, and racial profiling practices. People who are working on health care don't understand that the health care needs of the LGBT people in their communities might be a little bit different from the heterosexual norm in their communities. And when they don't have good access to data, or when the data that exists doesn't get out far and wide enough, then it's much harder for organizations to find an entry point into engaging with LGBT issues and constituencies. One of the most compelling pieces of data I ever heard, for example, was the fact that Don't Ask, Don't Tell disproportionately affects people of color who serve in the military, particularly black women, who really constitute people who much higher numbers of people who are dismissed from the military on the basis of don't ask, don't tell, than their numbers should indicate. And if that is the case, then that means to me that racial justice groups that are about protecting the rights of black women, should be quite involved in don't ask, don't tell, and in fights to get that policy revealed. But people don't know and therefore can't be clear strategically. The second barrier is the fear of dividing a community. One of the more interesting things we found was that the more issue areas an organization is already engaged in, the less likely they are to engage explicitly in LGBT issues. And that's a question that needs more further study, but one of the reasons that could be true is that they already have a great amount of heavy lifting to do to unify their communities around their whole issue platform, and that adding LGBT issues feels like just another potentially divisive thing to add. If they're going to be multi-issue, they tend to go toward immediately unifying issues, and the LGBT issues, for a variety of reasons, often don't make the top of that list. We did find that religious concerns arise for people, but that only happens after a group has actually gotten into doing the work on sexuality issues to begin with. If they're not already in it, then they don't often imagine that religion is going to come up a lot, but once they're in it, it does come up, and groups are, in fact, able to find ways to negotiate the religious interests of their constituencies and of their memberships, but it can be a little bit scary and intimidating to enter the fray on that front. The third barrier to engagement is simply inadequate funding. And this is one problem in which the fact that LGBT communities are seen as white and communities of color are seen as straight really gets in the way of funding adequately the most dynamic work that is going on and that needs to be replicated at this intersection. So LGBT funders don't see often the issues that are not on the national LGBT agenda as being LGBT issues. So, if it's not gay marriage and it's not don't ask, don't tell, and it's not the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, then an LGBT funder might really not be able to see, for example, the implications of immigration policy on LGBT families, or the implications of drug policy or housing policy. And so groups that work on those policies or that are primarily identified as racial justice groups can't get any attention from LGBT funders. And the reverse also happens. So racial justice funders who don't see sexuality issues as core to the racial justice agenda will have a difficult time recognizing all the LGBT people of color organizations as fundable organizations. I'm going to move on to the recommendations that we made. So the very first recommendation is simply to increase support for groups of color. And this is support that foundations can provide and philanthropists can provide through their funding of general support as well as capacity building grants. But it's also support that racial justice groups that are a little bit more established can provide to their colleagues who are trying to start organizing LGBT people of color specifically, helping them have space, giving them advice, including them in your community forums so that they can get some attention and energy. So first, in the increasing support for groups of color, really focusing on that category of LGBT people of color organizing. And then the second category among groups of color is to support both established and emerging collaborations and projects that engage racial justice groups and LGBT groups, both LGBT groups of color as well as predominantly white LGBT groups. So there's a lot of work to be done here in exploring that strategic clarity that was a barrier to engagement and creating these strategic imperatives that were one of the elements of success. And there's also some work to be done here in filling the gap for racial justice organizations that are leaving behind conservative funders that maybe support their racial justice agenda, but really do not support a sexual liberation agenda. More and more racial justice groups are saying they will not apply for grants from the Catholic Church, for example, for precisely that reason. And at least some transitional support needs to be figured out for those groups so that they can become independent of sources that limit their engagement in sexuality issues. The second recommendation is to support, invest in tools for strategic clarity, and this is really largely about research and data as well as partnerships between research intermediaries and community-based organizations that can generate the information needed. The third recommendation is to hugely raise the visibility of LGBT leaders of color, certainly to fund leadership development programs and to start leadership development programs that pay a good deal of attention to that constituency, to do some needs assessment of leaders in this field, leaders of color in this field, and really to build up their leadership capacity in a bunch of different areas, from strategic thinking to actual organizing. And then the fourth and final recommendation is to build the media and communications capacity of LGBT leaders of color and of the groups that are working at this intersection. Funders here can do a lot by including LGBT people of color organizations as well as racial justice organizations working on LGBT issues in their newsletters and conferences and briefings in a range of the places where funders and philanthropists get their news and their talking points from. But we also need to be building media and communication skills development into leadership development initiatives and into technical assistance programs. And we need to try to bolster the communications capacity of racial justice and LGBT groups of color by borrowing or deploying the communications programs of foundations themselves. So that is the end of my presentation. Just to recap, I want to thank the Arcus Foundation again for funding this study. I want to note that along with the work that we are doing to influence racial justice organizations, others that Arcus and other funders are funding, other groups are working on the other end of influencing the behavior and the agendas of LGBT groups that are predominantly white, so that they will also be able to work at this intersection in a more effective way. And in closing, I'll just reiterate that there is already tremendously successful work that is happening in communities all across the country. That work has happened with very, very little resources invested in it, and it could completely blossom and grow and really have create a quite significant change in our political landscape if it were to be supported in a way that would allow it to be replicated and to get the attention that it really deserves. Thank you so much.